Hello, this is Sydney Lamb, and today I'm going to talk to you about response to intervention. So what is response to intervention, or RTI? Response to intervention, or RTI, utilizes assessment and intervention in a tiered or leveled system, maximizing achievement and reducing behavior problems. So what's the purpose? Why RTI? RTI's purpose is to provide all students with opportunities to succeed. It is also to identify students with learning or behavioral problems and provide them with appropriate instruction and supports. The goals of RTI are to integrate resources to minimize risk for long-term negative consequences associated with poor learning or behavioral outcomes. Another goal is that it strengthens the process of appropriate disability identification. The three levels of prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Here we have a little graphic outlining each level, and we'll get to talking about the meaning of this graphic in just a moment. First off is the primary level of prevention. This involves high quality instruction that meets the needs of most students. So here, this bottom part of the triangle is the largest part, so it means that it meets the needs of most. So it's not as specialized. It's also the least intensive level of prevention, which involves universal screening and differentiation. Some characteristics of the primary level are research-based core curriculum and culturally and linguistically responsive instructional practices. With the progress monitoring data related to primary levels, if the students don't benefit from it, then they move on to the secondary level of prevention. In the secondary level of prevention, right here, it involves evidence-based prevention as opposed to with primary it had research-based. So here we have evidence-based prevention. It is also of moderate intensity, so it's slightly more intense than it was in the primary level. It addresses the learning and behavioral problems and needs of most at-risk students. So it's slightly fewer students are addressed in the secondary level. And it also involves small group instruction. The characteristics of secondary level are that it is evidence-based, it is adult-led small group instruction, and there is clear and validated intervention here. With the progress monitoring data, if it is clear that the students don't benefit from the secondary level, they move on to the tertiary level of prevention. In the tertiary level of prevention, it is the most intensive, and it specifically targets the students' individual needs. So this area right here, it's a lot smaller because it affects even fewer people. It's just on an individual level, so very few people. And then the teacher uses a more intensive form of intervention program from the secondary level. So they just take the secondary level's prevention program and they just make it more intense. It also involves more frequent progress monitoring. So every week or so, this is a way to modify the prevention according to the student's progress. Now through this progress monitoring and modification, there should be more effective and individualized program being created. Now to the referral process. Let's start with the documentation you might need. There's a referral checklist documenting with things that you must document before you can refer. So you must document the student has received sufficient instruction along with sufficient and appropriate language assistance. Document that acculturation and language issues are addressed during the RTI process because these issues can be excluded as a significant factor involved in the student's problems. It must also be documented that RTI was appropriate and sufficient enough to determine student achievement capacity with bilingual interventions. It must also be documented that RTI was appropriate and sufficient enough to resolve any student problems. And there must be documents that students' response to intensive or Tier 3 instructional interventions were inadequate, inappropriate, or troubling. So just not quite what they need to be. And there's next up, there will be an assessment of data done by the district before referring to FIE. So there must be a specific point in the intervention process that is identified for making the final decision, and it determines whether or not to refer the student to FIE. There must also be addressed that there is a identified and trained team that makes the decision to refer based on documented and monitored interventions. So they can't just refer a child just because they feel like it. There must be data and it must be monitored. And then there must also be documentation that is adequate and appropriate to move from tiers of intervention to a referral. And the documentation is used to certify that learning and behavior problem is not due to a cultural or linguistic difference. So that did not cause the learning or behavior problem. And then there must also be documentation identifying students' language and acculturation needs, as well as any remaining language or behavioral problems. There's also a process for documenting the results of the tiered intervention and how these documents were used to justify the referral. The referral is complete. What's next? Up next is testing. This ensures eligibility and access to any and all special programs. This testing must be varied and appropriate in order to assess the student's levels of functioning. So some types are observational data, intellectual assessment data, adaptive behavior data, social and emotional behavior data, sociocultural information, academic test data, and a language assessment. Thank you for listening to my presentation.